It is now my pleasure to introduce Aaron Morrison. Aaron Morrison is the chair of the board of directors of the Juneau Economic Development Council, elected just recently in December of 2025. He's a licensed professional engineer with over 25 years of experience in energy infrastructure and construction, 17 of those in Alaska. He brings deep technical and strategic expertise to strengthening Southeast Alaska's economy and resilience. Based in Juneau for over a decade, Aaron serves as Natural Resources Director at our cousin organization, Southeast Conference, and previously held leadership roles with RESPEC and PCL Construction, managing major projects such as the SLAM facility and the Juneau International Airport recent upgrade. An active community member, he also serves on his Juneau Rotary Club board. Aaron holds engineering and business degrees from UC Berkeley and San Jose State, and remains dedicated to advancing energy reliability and sustainable development across Alaska. Please join me in welcoming JEDC Board Chair Aaron Morrison.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Morrison, and I have the privilege of serving as a newly elected chair of the Juneau Economic Development Council Board. On behalf of JEDC, welcome to the Innovation Summit. Thank you for making the effort to be here. Taking time out of busy schedules to focus on Alaska's economic future is not a small thing. Building what comes next for our state starts with people who are willing to show up and engage. JEDC chooses to create this venue very intentionally. The economic issues facing Alaska are not abstract. They affect our businesses, our workforce, our families, and the decisions our kids make about whether to stay, leave, or return. These conversations deserve more than reactive debate. They deserve structure, focus, and broad participation. That is why we organize this summit, to actively engage Alaskans in developing potential solutions. We bring together business leaders, public officials, educators, tribal partners, entrepreneurs, and community members. Innovation is not a slogan, it is a discipline. It requires collaboration, candor, and a willingness to rethink old assumptions. The overarching purpose of the Innovation Summit is to help build Alaska's capacity to innovate. Capacity means more than having a good idea. It means having the talent, the data, the networks, and the culture to turn ideas into action. If we want a resilient and forward-looking economy, we have to build that capacity together. My own path to Juneau reflects some of the push and pull that shapes Alaska. Years ago, I sat my wife, Tracy, down in our Anchorage home and said, "Hey, remember that potential construction project in Juneau? Well, my company got it. I'm on it, and it's 3 years long. How would you like to move?" There were tears. They were not tears of joy. But over time, what began as a professional opportunity became something more. Juneau became home. We raised our daughters here. We built careers here. We learned that a place like this, relationships matter and community matters. The choices we make about our economy matter. Alaska is navigating profound demographic and workforce shifts. Migration patterns, labor force trends, and population changes are shaping the opportunities available to every community in the state. If we are serious about building capacity to innovate, we have to understand these forces clearly. That is why I'm so fortunate to highlight our program with someone who has spent his career studying exactly those dynamics. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Cooke. Dr. Cooke is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Geography, Sustainability, Community, and Urban Studies at the University of Connecticut, where he directed the Urban Studies Program, the Center for Population Research, and Connecticut's U.S. Census Data Center. He is a Fulbright Scholar and recipient of the Research Excellence Award in Population Geography from the American Association of Geographers. An expert in migration, workforce demographics, and advanced census analysis, Dr. Cooke has advised organizations including RAND and Brookings, and is frequently cited in national outlets such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. As Alaska navigates profound demographic and labor force shifts, we are fortunate to hear from one of our country's leading migration scholars. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Cooke.
Hello. This is usually where you say, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting me. But actually, I'm surprised I'm here. Some of you know I drove to Boston for the flight. I live in Hartford. Had the 1 in 50 year actual massive blizzard. Most of Rhode Island has 3 feet of snow, 41 inches in a few places. So it was a mess getting here. Planes, trains, automobiles, ended up driving to Philadelphia. And there's a reason I bring this up other than that Brian and I had a remarkable resilience in working this out. Because I was in the hotel and 2 things. Well, actually, there's 3 things. I got to enjoy people day drinking. The second one is I met a woman from Alaska, and I said to her, I'm actually really disappointed Alaskan Airlines can't fly in this, right? I would expect that this is nothing for them. And she said, well, they probably have a pilot from the lower 48. But the other thing I thought to myself is, most of us are like this. I looked out the window at 60-mile-per-hour winds, and I thought, why the heck am I living here? You know, what am I getting from this? And I'm not very good at burying the lead, but I would say this place means something to me. And we've already been hearing about this. Place is important, and we focus, I think, too much on out-migration. And as David showed, Alaska has a lot of churning. You have plenty of people moving into the state. But what about keeping them? And that's really going to be my focus today. All right? Let's see if I can operate this properly. So I want to start with the title of this conference, Push-Pull, which is a pretty typical way of looking at migration. But I want to kind of build it up and think about or talk about how demographers look at migration more in the more contemporary way. Not that the push-pull is wrong, but there's a couple pieces missing. And hopefully talking about those things will help you think about what's going on in Alaska. But let's, start with push-pull. It was first developed by a demographer called, Everett Lee in the mid-60s. And he identified 4 forces shaping migration. There's push factors, which are, the things, not just the negatives, but also the positives. There's pull factors, things that pull people towards an area. And so the idea is people are very rational, and they add up the positive and negatives of where they live, and positive and negatives of living someplace else. And, they move or decide to locate in the place that has the best combination. And the push factors can be conditions that encourage leaving. And it can be a wide variety of things, but especially wages, cost of living, quality of life. And the pull factors are the same things: economics, quality of life, housing costs, connections to the community, right? And importantly, then there's what we call intervening opportunities. The distance of moving to a new location, other opportunities that are closer than some other opportunities you may be looking at, Key to this is distance and cost, and obviously Alaska is facing that issue, but you've been facing it for generations. But information is a very important dimension of that. In fact, I was telling some friends, I'm going to Alaska for this conference. Connecticut, what do people know about Alaska? Surprising. I have to say, when I was asked to give this presentation, and they'll comment, I'm like, oh no, I'm in a lot of trouble. I know, as I'm a geographer, I'm supposed to know about Alaska, but I don't know that much about it. So even if there's great opportunities, people in the West, especially in the East, but there's not a lot of information. Now, fortunately, and I'll talk about this in a minute, the internet, information technology has improved, so people can have, they can search and they can learn a lot, and maybe Alaska will come up. And then there's personal factors. And this model really doesn't focus a lot on personal factors. And I'll talk more about the personal factors in a few minutes, but I'll jump ahead and, the family is key to migration. And I've spent most of my career, or a big chunk of my career, looking at how families make migration decisions and its impact, mainly economically, on the head of households and or their partners. And so I'm really going to focus a lot on the family, right? Let's see here. But first, let's look at some data. Good, you can see it well. The US Census conducts a survey every year called the Current Population Survey. And one of the questions that they ask is, why did you move? And it's really instructive to look at this data. This is actually pooled over like 15 years, and it's for the whole United States. So they said, where did you live 12 months ago? And then why did you move? And what I think is really interesting here is that, I can't even look at my own numbers, 32% of people say they moved for a job, or a new job, or a relocation. And that's probably a lot lower than most people would expect. But what I do think, I think there are some people in the employee relocation industry here. It's a sort of an aside, but I find it very interesting that maybe 20% or 30% of the people who move for employment reasons are actually moving through the employee corporate relocation industry. This is something that really hasn't been studied very much, but it's sort of, there's like an institutional process going on here. And yeah, I'm having a hard time looking at my own notes, I apologize. And so people also relocate for jobs, to be closer to jobs, or to retire. There's a whole dimension of employment, but it's not necessarily for a new job, right? And that's like 42% of the moves are broadly related to employment. Another 29% is related to the family. And I would argue that basically almost all moves are family moves. They involve a family decision. Think about moving to college and how much parents are involved in that decision and shaping that decision about moving to college. Think about somebody who moves after they get divorced. That's a family process. Or people who are in a dual career couple trying to figure out how you move maybe for one person in the family and accommodate the other person. Or moving because you have a new child. That again is a family process. So I'm going to talk a lot about place, but I also think that we really have to think about what's going at the family level. And maybe that's part of what is happening in Alaska. The third component, 20%, is housing. And some of you might find that very surprising, how little it is. I've already heard from some of the people I'm talking to in the audience, and also preparing for this, is that there's not a very large supply of housing, and the rental market is relatively expensive. But people just, that's a smaller component than you would think it is. Right, and today, you hear a lot about people who are stuck in place because, well, older people aren't moving because they have very low interest rates on their mortgages. Or people in other places might be underwater in their mortgages. There's been quite a lot of research on this, and strangely, there's not a lot of evidence that those, like the housing lock issue, is really preventing people from moving. Kind of a little bit of a disconnect between the empirical research and what we think about every day. And then there's other reasons, which is 11% of the population say other reasons. We're talking about climate. And again, a lot of people in the literature or research think, or I mean in the public, feel as if people are moving to the Sun Belt for the climate, okay? But again, the evidence shows that that's not a very strong drive. And then there's like general quality of life. So, it doesn't really match up. The push-pull model is good, and a lot of these factors we're talking about are related to the push-pull model, but it's a little bit different than what we would generally think is driving people to move. So the push-pull model, thinking just in those terms, is weak. One of the most important things you would expect is people would leave economically declining areas to economically buoyant areas. And again, this is what I'm hearing from some of my discussions in Alaska, is that there's plenty of jobs here, right? And so you would expect, and one of the things you're kind of talking about, you would expect people would want those jobs. Same thing, people moving from high housing cost to low housing cost. You would expect to find people moving and these flows happening. And you would also expect people moving in one direction, right? And this is one of the most important points I want to make, and David brought this up as well, is that people are moving both directions. Every time, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, somebody says, everybody's leaving Illinois because of high taxes. Everybody's leaving Connecticut because of the climate. Everybody's leaving New York because of politics. If you look at some of these states that are losing population, like Illinois or New York, you see these headlines, everybody's leaving. But if you look at the states that are losing the most population, even the states that are losing the most to migration have maybe between like 60 and 70% people moving into those states. It's never one way. People may be different, and that's important to remember. So like in Sunbelt states like South Carolina, what you have is sort of a educational sorting. The people that move south from like New York, Connecticut, Illinois, the people that are moving towards the Sun Belt tend to be less educated, lower levels of education, I should say. And people are moving into those states, and then the people that are leaving those states tend to have higher levels of education. So you do see people moving from places like New York to the Sun Belt, and they're leaving in pretty high numbers. But there's always people moving the other direction, and they're not the same people. So the Sun Belt is actually gaining, they are gaining well-educated people, but they're also gaining very large numbers of people with lower levels of education, and they're, relatively speaking, they're losing their skilled population. And I'll come back to more criticism of this whole Sunbelt phenomena in a minute. And so that's, the last thing I want to mention here is that people move to areas that are expensive and have high quality of life. And I'll talk about this trade-off. And so personally, Connecticut hammers you economically. It's brutal, right? Like the snowstorm. I pay $16,000 in property taxes. I face a 5% flat income tax. I have a 6 or 7% state sales tax. You have a tax on buying and selling your house. I mean, they're going to get you everywhere, right? And my heating cost is $400-500 a month for natural gas. So why, so I'm looking out at this blizzard, and I'm thinking about, wow, I'm paying a lot of money. But it still matters. I still have that attachment to that place. Why? And I actually think that to myself frequently. This does not seem rational, all right? And it may not be rational, okay? So a big piece that is missing, later on, I'm trying to tell a story kind of historically. A big piece that is missing is what we call, well, it's place and how people value where they live. Now, in kind of economic modeling and so forth, we refer to place utility, which is really the value that a person places on where they live, right? Yeah. And part of it is accepting people are willing to exchange some of their income for quality of life, right? And so this is the case of Connecticut, right? You do have higher salaries there, but it most likely does not compensate for the higher cost of living. But what you're exchanging for most people is, in Connecticut at least, you're exchanging some of the best public schools in the country. You're exchanging the highest life expectancy in the country. You're exchanging, I mean, I'm not here trying to sell Connecticut, but I'm putting, because I started off by saying, why do I live here? I'll end up with the conclusion, okay? So it might become rational. I have friends that teach at the University of Washington, and their salaries are relatively low nationally. And they actually get told, literally, the statement that's used is the view is worth $50,000 a year. Now, that doesn't really solve people's economic problems, but people will exchange their income for a higher quality of life. And some of those things that people exchange for is, I have to move over here because I am following my notes. Oh, it's on, thank you, because there's no button. It's natural environment and climate, mountains, coast, weather, outdoor access. I'm sure that's many of the reasons people live in this area. When I flew in today, this is the first time I've been in Alaska. I've been here for about 5 hours. I barely made it. But I'll tell you already, the view coming in on the airplane was stunning. And I actually found myself like, wow, this might be an interesting place to live. The cultural and social life, arts, food, diversity, the pace of life, okay? And people that you know and you could relate to. Social networks and career infrastructure, the density of employers, professional peers, marriage markets. It might be a strange term for people to hear. But, you know, when you're looking for a mate, you know, you need to meet other people, and just like a market, you're buying a car, right? This car has this quality, this car has that quality, there's a price associated with it. I know it sounds a little harsh. I'm not so sure we really feel that way, but we do think in terms of marriage markets. If you live in a region that's not very diverse and has an older population, and you're 20 years old, 25 years old, it may not be that attractive because it's hard to meet a mate, okay? Then there's identity, belonging, community, which is key. And we use this word called rootedness. Are you, connected to your community? And usually, if you talk about rootedness, it has a negative connotation. The connotation is that you are somebody who is not a risk taker, right? Somebody who's going to accept the status quo. It's like I said, it's somewhat negative. But we'll see in a minute that type of connection and not moving is key, not just to community, but also economic growth. And then there's public services and institutional quality. The importance of public goods and services, things like schools and hospitals, mental health care, aging in place. Those things are important to people as well. Now, some of these things cost money, and some of these things people are willing to give up. So it's not entirely something you can put a number on, right? So adding in this place utility to the model is that we have like an economic calculation. What's the cost of living? What kind of job do I have? What kind of housing do I have? What's the cost of commuting? What's the cost of natural gas, right? Or I was just talking to, is it Brian? I'm sorry? Bill, I'm sorry. I was talking to Bill, and he was saying, he can't exactly call up, you're a developer, can't exactly call up Seattle and ask them for a cheap 2x4, right? It's hard, and not, to supply a place like Juneau and many places in Alaska with, the cost of goods and services that you might get elsewhere in the country. But what is the final piece of this puzzle, and I think is the most important one and the most interesting one, is that when you look at migration, and now I'm not talking about kind of the total number, the gross or net migration. I'm speaking about how people, individuals, make migration decisions. We see that almost all of them are very closely correlated with life course events. And we already had several speakers, and we've been talking to each other already about, I moved here because my children were older and had moved on, or they were living with their father, right? Most people move when these life events take place. Now, not all moves, right, are connected to life course events, but a vast majority of them are. You finish education, you graduate from high school, you graduate from college, starting a new job, maybe developing your career after you finished your education and moved out of your parents' home. You think, well, this is the sort of thing I want to do. I want this occupation or that occupation. And you might actually engage in several moves to build up your resume, right? So each one of those events leads to a migration. Forming a relationship, right, might actually prevent you from moving. But we actually see a lot of people make a connection with another person and then maybe move where that person lives or the other person lives. Having children, right? And I don't want to say this doesn't involve just migration. It also involves where you live within a city or a region, all right? Just residential relocation. Having children. You might live before you have children, you might live in a community that's a pleasant place to live for you, but once you have children, you might want to live in a different type of community. Losing a partner, either through death or through divorce. Again, if you have divorce, one person is pretty much required to move, right? And then retiring, right? And the key here is that people find themselves, when they have a life course event, living in a place that no longer provides them with the value they had before they moved. And I always use the example of a kid living in a college town, right? You take some small college town in the Midwest, that's kind of like one of the, models we have in our mind, and everybody there is pretty much connected with higher education, right? The day you graduate from college, and the day, from a college in a small town, that day, that town loses its value to you. You don't want to be that guy who's 25 years old and still going to fraternity parties. They're around there, right? But that day, you're suddenly like, well, I'm done here. I got to find a place for the next stage of my life that has value to me. So migration is clustered around events. And the second thing I want to say about this is that there is a very strong relationship because of that with migration and age. Okay? We generally find that when you're 20s, people move quite frequently because they're engaging in a lot of these life course events. They're graduating, finishing school, they're leaving their household, they're starting their career, they're meeting a partner, they're starting to have children, right? Or a whole host of things. And so they move frequently. Once people get into their 30s, their 40s, they might buy a house, they might have a family, whatever, but they become more rooted and stable in place. So we see migration start to level off and even decline as people age. And then, in their 60s, you see people moving again, okay? And of course, you generally see children not moving very much. And that's because their parents in their 30s are not moving much. So there's a strong relationship between life course events and aging. And it's because the value of a place changes as your life changes. I do want to point out that what I've just described is very normative. So I'm using, terms like you finish college, you get married, you have children, right? That's, a pretty narrow perspective, but I'm just using that as an example, right? And people go through their life. So in the past, we used to talk about the life cycle. This is kind of what I'm actually outlining here. And of course, like I just said, people, that's very normative, and people have very different things that are important to them and events that happen to them during their life. But the key here is most migration is associated with life course events. So I got ahead of myself a little bit here, sort of how we look at this. You have a life course event. It changes how you view the utility of living in a place. And then this opportunity comes up. People start thinking, is this the right place for me? Might there be some other place for me at this new stage in my life? All right. A couple points here. Come back to the family and the type of thing that can actually hold a person in place. connections to family, right? Dual career couples, really have a way of rooting people in place. The cost of moving is significant. And I'm not just talking about the financial cost, okay? I'm talking about, the cost of losing friends and losing that history that you experienced in that place. Information, as I mentioned, is key. And I'm not just talking about, okay, I want to move to Juneau. What are housing costs? What are job opportunities? What am I getting? Maybe it's a little more expensive to live here. Wages may not be as high, but what am I gaining? Okay? But it's also about narratives, because people frequently just don't gather all the information. They just hear things, right? Like, as I'll talk about in a minute, the Sun Belt. Well, everybody thinks the Sun Belt is low taxes, right? Job growth, all these, climate, right? And so we all think the whole Sun Belt has some miraculous place to live. And I'm getting ahead of myself again, but I don't see a lot of people moving to Mississippi and Alabama, right? Right? You have a lot of people moving to Georgia and South Carolina. And they're also moving to specific places in the Sun Belt. But we have narratives in our mind that shape what we think a place is like. And then, as we've mentioned earlier, uncertainty. And previous presenter was talking about the uncertainty of the fiscal climate of a state. And that is very important. People hear about this. You see the national headlines. Oh, again, taxes. They always talk about taxes, right? But people are fleeing Illinois for taxes, all right? So places may work at one stage of your lifestyle, and then they don't work later. So you can sort of push this all together. Push and pull are real, but they're incomplete. They don't include information about place utility, and it doesn't include information about life course changes. And you don't see a lot of the predictions of push and pull actually coming true. The other thing, this kind of more developed perspective, is that every flow has a counterstream. We hear, and narratives, as I'll mention, we hear everybody's leaving California for Texas. California is super expensive. They have this out of control government. They have out of control politics, and everybody's moving to Texas from California or from other parts of the country. But if I were to pull up the statistics, I'm trying to, not show too many statistics, you would see very large flows of people from Texas to California. Seems irrational, right? Migration follows life course events. And in fact, if you look at why individuals move, not in the aggregate, each one of you, you can explain a very large proportion of why you move based upon life course events. And retention, and that's a lot of what this conference is talking about, is retention. How do we stop this net out migration? And the key is, how do you find the people that match your place? Okay. So this is, I'm going to skip over this real quickly because I feel like I already covered it. You have this sort of normative model, which is easier to present. Young adults, what do they want? Frequently dense cities, right? I'll talk about some personal things. I have a daughter who's 30, how old is she? 37, right? And she's been living in Boston, and a variety, nothing bad, but she just feels like maybe, she would have a better time in another city, and she's moved to Chicago, right? People have children. They tend to move with children to suburbs with higher quality education. Once they're established, they tend to move less and later in life. and then much later in life, people might move to the Sun Belt or high amenity towns. In fact, you see a lot of assisted living centers located close to college towns. Because if you're in your late 60s, early 70s, you're looking for a calmer place. Many people, I should say, are looking for a calmer place to live, but one that has connections to, art museums and nice shops, nice restaurants, maybe events like plays and the theater, and College Town offers that. So that's a general model of migration, and like place and life course are key to it. What I want to talk about next is that the context for making decisions about moving is changing, right? The economy changes, politics changes, technology changes. We have a lot of shifts. But what's key is, and it's interesting, is the way in which people make migration decisions over time remains relatively constant. The reason you see shifts over time is that there's these structural shifts, right? So the outcomes of those decisions will be different over time. And one of the most interesting things that I've learned in the last few decades is that migration rates have plummeted in the United States. I actually am, the thing with social science is there's not a lot of us out there, right? There's not a lot of migration scholars, right? Maybe serious migration scholars might be 500 people in the country, right? These aren't huge fields. And I was getting ready for a presentation maybe 15 years ago. I can't remember why, but I wanted to look at data about migration trends in the US. And this data is widely available, right? It's from the Current Population Survey, which is, again, the same survey I talked about before, this annual survey that looks at where people move and why they move. And the data is right there on the census, right? And you see this trend. This is for moving between states, which has gone from, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, from around 3.5% of the population each year would move from one state to another. Now it has dropped down to about 1.5%, more than a 50% drop in moving from state to state. I showed this to some of my colleagues, people at Dartmouth, UCLA, Washington, well-known migration scholars, and they were universally flabbergasted. It's like, I never even knew that, right? Some obvious things. And so we have made this transition from a highly mobile country to a very rooted country. And this is not connected to the economy, because this is happening when the economy is booming or the economy is doing badly, right? I'm sorry, I keep on going over here because I think my clicker is over here. So getting people to stay is not as hard as it used to be, because they're already staying in place. Several reasons. One is migration has become riskier, right? In the 50s, 60s, 70s, many people worked for large corporations. And part of that model in the 50s, 60s, 70s is frequent moving for your career, right? People my age, you might think, how their parents moved, or actually in those days, how your father moved. And I experienced a lot of moves. People in their 50s and 60s can think back. I showed this to my mom like 10, 15 years ago. She goes, oh yeah. She goes, and I remember, and she mentioned this, how many moving trucks you would see parked in front of people's houses on a regular basis. You never see them anymore. I mean, I shouldn't say never, but it's very rare. It was just part of our lifestyle to move, move, move. But migration has become riskier. People don't have permanent careers, and even if you're moving to a large corporation, you don't even know if that job's going to be there in a couple years. A big Connecticut corporation, General Electric, 20 years ago was one of the biggest corporations in the world. And they were headquartered in suburban Connecticut, down in the southwestern corner of Connecticut, which is very wealthy, near Greenwich. And they felt that they needed to be in a more vibrant location and to take advantage of kind of the creative class idea that was popular at that time. So they moved to Boston. And they took with them all these people to Boston. Well, their whole business model collapsed. General Electric, I don't even know how big it is, but it's definitely not one of the top 100 companies in the world anymore, right? So people look at that and like, is that job going to be there in the future? It's riskier and riskier to move. Alternatives to moving have increased. Remote work. It's not just remote work, it's also remote education. You can get the outcome of moving without having to move, right? In more about information technology, it also allows you to search for a job more efficiently. Traditionally, a lot of migration involves return migration. People move to a place, it doesn't work out, and they go back. And I'm not talking about people, leaving Alaska when they're 20 and coming back when they're 50. I'm talking about people just returning back and forth within a year or two. That risk or that type of behavior is less common now. And constraints on moving have multiplied. Multi-earner households is very difficult to move when you have, one person is working 2 jobs and another person is working 2 jobs, deciding to move across country, it's just like, how are we going to work that out, right? And then population aging is a big component. Older people tend to move less often. As our population becomes older, there's more people who don't move. That might only be about 20% of it. And then, again, family ties. Connection, not just within the family and having difficulty finding a job for 1 or 2 or 3 people in the household, but people moving to be with elderly parents or for elderly parents to move closer. And if you're already living where you have elderly parents, you're less likely to move, right? People tend to move to places where they already know. The cost of moving, as I said, is actually going up, and part of that is risk. And then uncertainty. And we were already talking about that. There is definitely a connection between really kind of state finances or the vibrancy of the economy. Like, maybe I have a good job and I feel good about that job, but man, Connecticut, taxes are out of control, and this is what happened in Connecticut. There's a lot of uncertainty about, is the state going to be able to provide the services that look attractive there? The last thing I want to say about uncertainty is that connection, well, 2 things. One is inertia. You have to be careful because a lot of people will argue, a lot of academics will argue, that people who move, obviously they're engaging in a risky behavior, right? So you tend to think about movers as being vibrant and innovative, right? And explorers. They're taking this risk because they want to improve their life. And to get back to that idea of rootedness, people who are staying in place have been traditionally looked upon as backward, right? You look, why are people still living in West Virginia? There must be something wrong with them, right? They too are making rational decisions. They're looking at what is in that place and saying, I value this. So you have to be careful about kind of biasing what is good for a place in favor of migrants. Okay? Migrants are good because they are riskier, you know, but that doesn't mean that the people who stay are backward. So staying is the new normal. And there is a time dimension to that. Migration is a learned behavior. People who move during childhood a couple times are much, much more likely to move as adults. And it operates the other direction. Okay? If you have not moved very much, you're more likely to stay. And so what's happened is migration rates have gone down, and the children who have experienced less migration are more likely to stay, right? So rootedness is being transferred from one generation to the next. And it is because of that, it is becoming the norm. And again, like I said, for those people who have never moved and have stayed in place for a very long period of time, develop place attachment. If you've lived in a place or you move frequently and you're moving every 5 years, you don't have that time to build that connection to place, the community, the friends. But place attachment is more than just that, okay? It is your identity, your sense of belonging, who you are, right? One of the things I miss living in Connecticut, I grew up in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. One thing I miss, it's a stupid thing, is college football. I'm an insane college football fan. New England doesn't really have college football. I miss it constantly, right? I identify with that, okay? And if you follow college football, I got my Ph.D. from Indiana. I cannot believe they won the national championship. It is historically the worst college football program in 150 years of college football. And they won the national championship. So very happy about this, right? So what does this mean for Alaska? Okay, the goal should not necessarily, I mean, you're still dealing with migration. You still want those people coming in. But think more about keeping the people, providing what they need in order to develop those connections and identity with place. I'm running out of time, but I'll run through taxes and migration. And the reason I'm bringing this up isn't just because Alaska is facing this discussion. That is not why I'm really bringing it up. Because taxes and migration, you hear this argument in every single state, constantly, right? But I also bring it up because it demonstrates the importance for many people of attachment to place. Just grabbed this off the internet, took me half a second to find this. 95% of Illinoisans, you'd think they would come up with a better word, 95% of Illinoisans moving out head to lower tax states. What they don't tell you is that people in Indiana and Wisconsin who have very low tax rates are moving to Illinois. Right? So you have kind of these biased pictures, these very political narratives. It's an elegant idea. You can go back to Alexander Hamilton, who said states would be restrained from abusing their taxation power because if they imposed excessive or oppressive taxes, their citizens could just simply move to neighboring states with better tax policies. So we're talking 250 years we're discussing this. And I am going to try to speed up a little bit. And you see this, that taxes aren't even on this list of reasons for people moving. It's just not there, right? Even if you move for taxes, housing costs actually swamp the savings. So this is data from 2018. If you were to move from California to Texas, This is an average family earning $75,000 a year. Your tax savings might be $3,500 a year, but your mortgage, you would save $14,000. You see the same sort of thing from New York to Texas, or Illinois and Tennessee, or Connecticut to South Carolina. The impact of lower taxes is really pretty small. But this is where you get that narrative thing coming through, right? Because we have this idea that this is some kind of idyllic, the Sun Belt is sort of idyllic, low taxes, small government, right to work states, low cost of living. But the evidence just doesn't suggest that. I've talked a lot about Connecticut. The reason I'm bringing this up is not because it's about Connecticut. It's actually one of the best studies available. You see Connecticut actually in the 1980s was really struggling economically. It's had no income tax, and it's sort of like Alaska, but it was relying heavily upon taxing capital gains from the wealthy people that live in places like Greenwich. And so if the stock market was doing well, revenues would go up. If it does bad, revenues would go down. And the state just didn't have that stability. And a lot of people were leaving the state, or the state was struggling economically. The governor convinced in 1991 or 1992, it started to institute an income tax. And you see, after that income tax, the state finances started to improve and migration started to improve. And the reason this is a good study is because the person who did this, she looked at migration between Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. And you could live and work in any combination of those three. They were very similar types of neighborhoods, communities you could live in. So people have an easy choice to move between one of these three states, okay? But you saw no effect of this tax change. In fact, this article, journal article, estimated that 600 people might have left Connecticut because of the change in taxes. I mean, it's just negligible, right? So the evidence isn't there for taxes and migration. It's just not. And the low tax idea obscures a much bigger story. I think that the low tax idea is really sort of a proxy for kind of all the benefits that people think exist in the Sun Belt, right? We think of the Sun Belt as, again, this kind of idyllic place. But the Sun Belt really didn't do much to attract population and economic growth. It was sort of in the right place at the right time. And really what drove that growth is economic growth connected to the development of interstates and all kinds of federal policies that opened up the South to economic development, okay? But the thing is, it's really not limited to the Sun Belt. You have a lot of Sun Belt places that are doing poorly. Jackson, Mississippi, Birmingham, Alabama, not doing very well. And you have some places like Atlanta or Charlotte, North Carolina that are buoyant, right? And at the same time, you actually have a lot of places outside of the Sun Belt that are growing in a very similar way to many of these successful Sun Belt locations. And I'll point out Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, Des Moines, Minneapolis, Grand Rapids have dramatically shifted their economy and regional development policy in a way that sort of mimics what is going on in the Sun Belt. And this is my opinion, but what really seems to be driving success in the Sun Belt and success in cities in the Midwest is a unified vision. Okay, is having an organization like this organization, convincing people to all have a common vision, a common purpose, a common direction. And it's not about a city, it's more about a region. So I'll tell you another story of Connecticut. Connecticut let's think. Well, let's put it this way. You can drive from, the furthest you can drive in Connecticut is about an hour and 40 minutes. You know, it's minuscule, right? And it's divided into 169 independent municipalities that function as cities. There is 0 unincorporated territory in Connecticut. These 169 towns are about 20, 25 square miles. And the towns are, all municipal services are town-based. There's no county or regional organizations that function in Connecticut. When I first moved there 30 years ago, I met somebody, chit-chatting with them, and I told him, you know, I just moved from Indiana, and this was a big move. And he said, oh yeah, I just moved to West Hartford recently. I was like, oh, where are you from? He said, New Britain. Now, New Britain, Connecticut shares a border with West Hartford. These are independent kingdoms and identities. And what really hurts Connecticut's economic growth is they don't have a regional focus. And what really helps a lot of the cities in the Sun Belt and the cities in the Midwest is these cities all have large regional governments. And it's key that you get all these areas within a region to work towards having a common vision. So the Sun Belt is sort of a misnomer, and the tax belt, the high tax argument is sort of shorthand for a whole host of things a region can do. It's not about taxes. Even millionaires stay. A good study by Young in 2016 studied how very wealthy people move between states and the impact of taxes on the movement of the wealthy. And he found basically no effect. He concluded millionaire tax flight is occurring, very small, but only at the margins of statistical and socioeconomic significance. If you applied his estimates of the impact of taxes on millionaire migration to Alaska, if Alaska had a 1% income tax, you would lose 2 millionaires. You would not lose the wealthy. NVIDIA's CEO talked about California's proposal of a wealth tax, and it's a huge tax. I think it's something like 10%. It's nuts. And he said, I'm not moving. We chose to live in Silicon Valley, and whatever taxes I guess they would like to apply, so be it. I'm perfectly fine with it. I like to live in that state where we're about to perish. I do my best work in that condition. Elites are embedded in their place. I look at a place in Connecticut like Greenwich, Connecticut, and it might be the wealthiest place in the country, right? Billionaires, 100 million, it's just the wealth is filthy, right? They won't move because they want their kids to go to the same schools, they want to belong to the same country clubs, they want to know the people who are also innovators and successful. They want that face-to-face contact and network, and they are willing to pay the taxes to get the infrastructure and the services they need to succeed, right? So even millionaires are attached to place. You can look at that. I'm going to scoop kind of reiterates what I've already discussed. So I'm not an expert in Alaska. But I think there's an opportunity for Alaska. As we've noted, Alaska has an out-migration problem, not an in-migration problem. There's plenty of people coming through Alaska, but they're leaving, apparently shortly after, within a few years, especially younger people after they arrive. We've already gone over this discussion. But if you take the life course right? We were talking about we're losing 20, 25, Alaska's losing 25, 30-year-olds, right? They're highly mobile. But those people are going to become the 30-year-olds and the 40-year-olds that are going to be more rooted. So you're losing 25-year-olds, which is not good, but the impact is you're not going to have enough 35-year-olds who are embedded in place. And maybe a way to address this is not to think so hard about the 25-year-olds, but think harder about the 35-year-olds, because the 25-year-olds might be looking at the 35-year-olds. I'm going to be there in 10 years. What is Alaska doing for me? Is Alaska investing in schools, social services, public goods, roads, et cetera, utilities? Are they building a community? Are they building a place where somebody can make their life? All right? And I think what little I know about Alaska, that's your opportunity. That's what I just said. Family formation is the highest stakes. And again, I don't want to be, normalize, or use a normative type of approach. But people who have more than one or two or three people living in a household, they stay longer. It's harder for them to move, right? They build the social fabric. Those are the people that are going to school board meetings. Those are the people who are engaged in town politics. Those are the people that are establishing businesses, right? Those are the people who are establishing connections. Those are the people who become, start to identify with their communities, and they stay and they care. So one way maybe to keep the 25-year-olds is to build a community where people see that this is a future for me. Okay? And this may not be totally accurate for Alaska. It's just been exposed to Alaska for 3 weeks and sort of how I'm filtering my knowledge about migration through what I've heard or understand about Nebraska. A key piece, and this is a paper I wrote, is that 20 years ago, there's a lot of discussion about millennials and the creative class. Every town, region, state was obsessed with building communities that had well-educated young adults, and it was a large population, and they felt that these young adults would interact and create innovation and economic growth. But what I found is that it is the number of married couple families with children explains economic growth better than the creative class. They are going to create the economic growth that you seek. So I got to wrap it up here. I've already gone over about 15 minutes, which is pretty typical. So focus, target, invest. I've mentioned that. Not a lot of places. Well, I only found one place that really is doing this, and that's Boise, Idaho. They actually have a family-first policy. They're trying to provide low-cost housing and public services, not for all these 25-year-olds that have moved there, but for families. And that might be an interesting place to start investigating, is Boise. And focus on fiscal instability. I'll come back, the last thing, or two last things I'll say, is that, and I forgot to mention this earlier, Connecticut instituted the income tax in 1992. They suddenly had ungodly amounts of money coming into state government, and they spent like drunken sailors. They still had budget deficits, and the way they funded the budget deficits is to stop contributing to state employee pensions. And we had the worst state employee pension system in the country. It was basically bankrupt. And because of that, our bond ratings plummeted, and we had to pay more in interest rates, which further exacerbated the state government finances. I'll give you one piece of advice. If Alaska or any state was going to institute this type of tax, build guardrails Connecticut didn't build guardrails until like 15 years ago. There were 10 years where, for example, University of Connecticut moved up to the highest level of college football, and they built a nice stadium for $80 or $100 million. The state actually paid for it in cash. They didn't bond it. We have all this money, just pay for it, right? Insanity. So any state that wants to institute this sort of tax, you really need to put some fiscal boundaries on that tax. So, how do we become a place where the right people at the right stage of life find it rational and meaningful to stay? I'll finish up with what I started with. Why do I live in Connecticut? I'm going to move. But why am I going to move? Unfortunately, I was recently divorced, and my children are moving on, Chicago, Boston, different areas. What's the tie? I don't know. There isn't as much one now. I have 2 children living in Chicago and my first grandchild. I'm moving to Chicago. It was life course events. It's a life course. The family is key. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.